How do I act so well? What I do is I pretend to be the person I'm portraying in the film or play.
Yeah.
You're confused.
No,
Perfectly simple. Case in point, Lord of the Rings. Little Peter Jackson comes from New Zealand, says to me, Sir Ian, I want you to be Gandalf the wizard. And I say to him, you are aware that I am not really a wizard. And he said, yes, I am aware of that. What I want you to do is to use your acting skills to portray the wizard for the duration of the film. So I said, okay. And then I said to myself, how would I do that? And this is what I did. I imagined what it would be like to be a wizard, and then I pretended and acted in that way on the day.
Yeah.
And how did I know what to say? The words were written down for me in a script. How did I know where to stand? People told me.
All right. This is a Taproot Therapy Collective podcast. I'm here with Andy Philpo, a big film guy, a designer. We're going to talk about some new technology, but first he's going to come on and apologize for the horrible accusations against him. No, and I don't want to get too much into that yet, but it is definitely the reason that Galaxy's Edge got shut down at Disney World. So I'll let you take it from there.
Wow, thanks for that great intro, Joel. My bosses are going to be so glad that I agreed to come on the podcast now.
I remember, Matthew, like our friend from college, and I remember like watching the what is it, Jerry Seinfeld? Who's the actor that plays Kramer? What's that guy's name?
Michael Richards.
Michael Richards. Yeah, Michael Richards was apologizing on Letterman via teleconference while Jerry Seinfeld was the guest, and Jerry Seinfeld was just screaming at the crowd like, "Stop laughing! It's not funny." I mean, I've seen it happen a couple of times in my life, but when you're a stand-up comedian on a stage yelling at the audience, "Stop laughing! It's not funny." Like, does something not go off in your brain, being like, "Oh, this isn't working"? You know?
It's peak ironic comedy.
Yeah, unless you're Eric Andre, like you're doing something wrong when you're yelling at the crowd to stop laughing. I don't know. So we've talked a little bit about filmmaking before. You're more kind of on the technical end of stuff, and I was hoping that this would kind of turn into like a filmmaking series. We had a couple guests, Chris Rogers, who wrote *Halt and Catch Fire* and *Paper Girls* and a couple shows that I like, is going to come on. We'll record that next week. I don't know when it'll go out. And I don't want to like say who they are, because people definitely have the right to like not come on a show like this, which is probably a waste of their time, But I sent a couple of different emails to people that are trying to see if we can make it work with scheduling and whatever of like little things. So I don't know, maybe we'll get a critical mass of some Hollywood people, but I thought it'd be fun to talk about the way that you're applying technology, because it is so different. And even though some of the things, like you had talked a little bit about Disney's projects, but even though like what you're doing is like way more state of the art, I guess, than even the blue screen 90s stuff, it feels older world. Like it feels like the soundstage 70s type filmmaking that I like more than what we've done for the past 15 years.
Well,
So the psychology of that, I think, is ripe for discussion, and I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah. So yeah, I no longer work at Disney. I've moved on to some other things, but of course they're the big touchstone for like visual effects and production and things like that. So now I do a lot of like concert design, live events, things like that. But the technology that you're talking about, sort of what gets labeled in the industry as like in-camera VFX, right? Now you're absolutely right. It's like a super old technology, because the oldest versions of it was like you hung up a big rear projection screen behind the like James Bond car, and then you rolled your like B-roll of the California like countryside behind it, and like that was how you got the effect of someone driving. And so there's been a confluence of technologies in the last, say, 10 years maybe, that have made it possible to kind of like bring that sort of in-camera effect back to modern production paradigms. And they are very specifically, and it's interesting because of the relationship to the other like advancements in technology we've seen. But the first one is very like low pixel pitch LED tile, right? So
Mhm.
you can have lots of that, like your TV is like super high res. We can make that at like a wall sized scale, right? Like
Mhm.
everyone's seen the documentary about the Mandalorian with the big LED wall that they
I
call
I don't
like,
know that everyone has. If you don't mind, like, telling us a little bit about what that technology looks like on a set, because I
yeah,
think the hostility from film nerds, a lot of people hear technology and they say, like, "Get that out of my movie." Like,
right.
I don't want, episode 1 of Star Wars, I want the original trilogy or whatever, and they think of
Mhm,
people running around green screen where there's no reference point and, basically thousands of engineers making a movie instead of a filmmaker, but
right.
what we've gone back to is a little bit more like the old world, old Hollywood.
Yeah, so what that technology is, the touchstone that everyone thinks about with like extended reality sets in camera VFX, these are like the buzzwords that people use for it. But essentially what it is, it's a huge LED wall like you would see at like a
Does it
concert.
curve? Like, is it like a dome, like an IMAX thing?
It can be flat, but the one specifically for Mandalorian is a curved
Mhm.
LED surface, and then they do like a handful of tiles overhead to make like kind of a ceiling.
Mm.
But those are typically just a flat plane that's kind of just capturing some of the sky effect. And
But you're
then
still getting the ambient lighting that changes the way that the camera, light bounces off the actors and all that stuff that
right, and
makes it
that's
look like they're real.
yeah, so and that's really the big difference, right? And that's the advantage over something like green screen, where you see somebody on a green screen set, and you can tell almost immediately because the shadows on their faces are
Everything looks
reflecting.
gray. There's that
Yeah,
under contrasted, like,
and
look.
typically, if you look very closely, you can see the little hint of the green like back reflectance on whatever side is facing the chroma backdrop behind them. Whereas with the LED wall, your light is the reflectance of whatever the environment is, which is much closer to real life. And that's something that like you've talked about in, especially in the like healing the modern soul, the way that intuition kind of picks up whether or not something feels real based on those
Mhm.
sorts of like micro perceptions.
That
That
we basically, before we think about it, we already know if we like it or not, or if it's real or not.
Exactly, and it's like there's those like subtle things that like you don't look for unless you know to look for them. But as a designer, like that's your whole world is like trying to pick up on those things before the audience does and correcting for them. So that technology of the LED wall being able to create this environment, and then the corollary one is the advances in real time graphics,
Mhm.
the ability to create photoreal or near photoreal real time environments that you can generate on the fly that are tracking things like the camera movement in the physical world
Mm.
correlated to a camera in the virtual environment, so that as you pan the camera across the performer, the
Mhm.
camera in the LED wall is also moving and moving your scenery with it. And you can do those kinds of things in real time in a way that feels much closer to how it would look if you were shooting on location somewhere, as opposed to the green screen where it's like someone's got to place trackers and like physically move in post
Mhm.
production. We're now capturing all of that in the camera as the shot is being done. And it's just such a huge jump in the the speed at which you can create those things, and also the fidelity at which you're able to create them.
Well, and there's almost like in the prequel trilogy that a lot of people didn't like, there's almost the exact same scene at one point, as in the sequel trilogy, that I think people definitely liked the way it looked at least, more.
Hmm.
But there's like Obi-Wan is in the bubble cockpit of a ship, and there has to be like a laser blast goes by, and then he has to react to it, but the way that they're making it in the prequel trilogy, which doesn't really work or something feels wrong, is that the script has to say reacts to laser blast. So, Ewan McGregor has to go, "Oh," and look up. And then an animator has to go back in at about the same time that he looks up and make this blast, but there was no real connection between those things.
Right.
And when Oscar Isaac's in the X-Wing cockpit, you know, in the other one, it's sitting there on a screen with the sound and the light in real time. So you see him notice the laser blast go by, hit something, explosion, look up in a way that is not a manufactured surprise, or, you know, there's an actual connection between the parts of the film, which I think is like what people criticize about technology of like the early 2000s and, you know, 2010s, was that there was this disconnect where things were being made, you know, weeks and months apart and synthesized together in a way that didn't really work.
And it feels disjointed because the performers don't know exactly what it is that they're reacting to, and the creators, you know, the technical artists that are putting that in post are having to like work with this like pre-canned sort of reaction, whereas you can kind of like, you know, work with those things in real time in more of a modern virtual production environment. Another like great example of like things that you can do now that you couldn't do in that era is actually the Mandalorian armor that he wears. That's all that bright, like super
reflective light. Yeah,
chrome.
it'd be reflecting green screen. You couldn't.
Yeah, you can only get away with that in the Mandalorian LED wall environment, but it's such a cool effect to be able to achieve without having to go on location or like build an elaborate set, because that's one of the things that was really impressive for that show, was also the budget on which they were able to achieve all of that. Yeah, would have been 10 or 20 times as expensive 10 years ago.
Well, and when you can do anything, when you're trying to run through a giant set and have a J.J. Abrams style 20-minute introduction where they're dodging a hole in the ship while they're explaining how the world works. I mean, there's something about that is compelling, but I kind of like how the writing for the set has forced writing to go back to almost like plays, you know, like you're having Yoda talk to Luke in the swamp for a long time. Whereas there's no scene like that in the prequel trilogy. It's always just a huge whirlwind of a million things. And
it's to dust off my theater history for a second, it's a little bit like the difference between the desire for like unity of place versus the like sweeping opera kind of like set design, where you'd have like backdrop after backdrop that they would just fly in, and these really elaborately painted like massive scenic pieces, versus like having an entire play basically that takes place in one location over one like contiguous span of time. And those are just different philosophies that have fallen in and out of fashion over the years. But it's like we're in another cycle of that right now, as the technology available drives some of the creative of the story that you want to tell and how you want to tell it. And I don't like to say it that way, right? Like the tech should never be the tail wagging the dog of the story. But sometimes in exploration, you find opportunities to tell a better story with the tools that you have available to you.
Well, and that's my question. It's like a lot of people, if you say that you're in tech and theater, you know, movies, they hear technology and they think of Sam Altman saying, well, we're not even going to have actors anymore. We're just, you know, going to have generated video through generative AI, you know, or they think of the endless blue screen, you know, they think of the like, you know, just unending litany of effects in the Hobbit movie where there's like no soul, but it just goes on. And they think, okay, tech is bad, which I mean, technology, I think in movies is inevitable. It's how is it used? I mean, can you speak to that, or what do you say when somebody has a negative reaction to?
So I'm always very, I probably have one of the more neutral opinions on like AI and its current incarnation. Relative to a lot of people out there, insofar as like my experience with it has been that it's another tool in the toolkit for a lot of like creatives to use if they want to, especially as it is right now, because it's not perfect and it doesn't, in my opinion, and maybe never will be able to create stylistically the same way that a human does, you know, because it is all sort of like trained on what we do, and
it's trained on the past. You know.
So it'll never be able to intuit the future, at least in this current incarnation, right? Like there's a world 10, 20 years from now where maybe it does that, and I can't possibly know. But right now, I think something that it's interesting with, and this is actually something I'm interested to hear your take on, is that like, because it's trained on the past, because it's trained on this sort of like imprint of so much raw data that has been input by humanity since the dawn of the internet, it's like, does it kind of allow us to tap into our collective unconscious, to borrow a term from Jung, um, and show us things that maybe we wouldn't have arrived at, from our own sort of iteration and development of an idea, right? I can go type in something I've thought about to a program like Midjourney or ChatGPT and say, draw me a picture of what this might look like, and it might give me a dozen results that I never would have considered, other than like asking the AI to like sling some things at me. If my tunnel vision of my perception was only going down this one specific path, now I've got an array of other ideas that I can at least consider and react to as a designer and say, does this speak to my vision, or is this totally off base? And either of those responses is very useful for the like creative process.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, I think that like its ability to create something like a Pinterest board, or to
Hmm.
give you 8 designs for a set and then let you pick the one that you were wanting, to brainstorm is probably good, because I mean, your dreams are trained on the past, right? Like Jung
Yeah.
talks about how dream is something, it's a way of thinking about the past that lets us anticipate the future based on what's happened before we're thinking about what might happen. Um, so, like a lot of times, like AI is, especially the visual stuff, it is dreaming. It's like free associating with patterns, um,
Hmm.
which is what makes some of its weirdness, that it has like because there's so many pictures of dogs on the internet. Some of the early versions were like overtrained to spot faces of dogs. So they would like put dog
Right.
faces inside of like, beard pattern, or just places where it might see a pattern. So I mean, to me, that's so interesting, because you're getting into the stuff that I think is neat about, psychosis and the kind of deep brain. But I want to put a pin on that as a short point. Like I
Hmm.
think that a lot of the newer brain science that is interesting to me and clarifies things that never understood about the old pattern is that there's so much, it's the brain isn't really processing, like that's not really the key to understanding cognition. There's so much processing happening somewhere all the time. Consciousness is more of a filter. It's more of, what am I ignoring to focus on this.
Right.
And that things like the sensory gating theory of schizophrenia, a lot of these newer theories are saying like, well, when these problems with cognition happen, it's not that something is being created that didn't used to be there. It's that there's something not being filtered out that should be. And and so those AIs are essentially filters. They're going through a ton of what has been done by somebody else before, what makes it inherently not original.
Right.
And then they're looking at, how can we combine these in a way that reflects what you're asking me to do, which is a great way to brainstorm. Doug Rushkoff said that, he wrote these novels and then he improved the novels because he asked an AI, "Hey, what does a character do in all of these situations?" And everywhere where it said to do what he had done, he said, "That's not a good. That's not good." Like, and that it ended up but he never would have spotted those 30% of the tropes that were kind of lazy in his writing if it wasn't a computer saying, "Well, why don't they do this?" And that's what he had come up with. So I think like that. Also, so much of filmmaking is like juxtaposing weird genres. Like a lot of the really
Hmm.
influential stuff is like getting two really weird ideas and then putting them together to make a new thing, a space western or something.
Right.
And so I could see it being helpful for something like that, because it knows what this is, it knows what that is. You combine it, and then it's giving you interesting ideas about how to make a set, or how to do something like that, maybe.
Yeah, something I've found that it's really good at is that kind of like stylistic transposition, where it's like you have, you know, something that you feed into it, an image of some kind, and you say, show me this in these different like styles, right?
Hmm.
Or show me this in Star Wars, or Transformers or Ghostbusters or like whatever
Hmm.
the paradigm may be. But it's like, because it knows all of those things, it knows all the pop culture references, it can do this sort of interesting, there's a real bunny hole there, but like
Hmm.
you can modulate a bunch of settings and then get a certain amount of like your input versus the AI, doing
Hmm.
kind of a trace over of your given like image or thought. and then have it like spit back out. So I'm like, well, this is what it could look like, you know?
Well, and for like VFX, I could see it being a good polisher that when you
Mhm.
get the broad strokes of the effect that you're going for, it goes in and it cleans up the light rays or it cleans up the molten property of the water or the magic spell reflecting, light around. It doesn't require, a team of 100 engineers to go through and visually change each thing. But you still would need the human element of having the vision, which I think AI can't do. It
Yeah,
can't
absolutely.
distinguish between its own noise, you know?
Yeah, and definitely where it is now, it's not something that I would ever consider as like using for a totally finished product with no human
Mhm.
intervention. It's like it's definitely not there yet, but it's just very interesting to me the way that all of these technologies have kind of like come together. It's all sort of based on the same circuitry, the real-time graphics for in-camera VFX is GPU based, right? And then so is all of the AI stuff. And so these very specific high-powered circuits that can do all this fast compute are the things that are driving
Mhm.
kind of the moment of how we approach creating things rapidly at scale for entertainment. And that's true across like film and across concert production, which sometimes is sort of a microcosm of film because you're shooting this like live
Mhm.
experience for camera, but every show that's happened in the last 20 years has had a big LED wall behind the talent anyway. So
Mhm.
you're also kind of filming that, and that becomes your backdrop in some ways. And there's been a lot more like real time work that's gone into integrating that wasn't there even 5 years ago.
What's I think it's kind of like how, if you look at automotive features that are pretty mainstream that trickle into the consumer space, a lot of that stuff, especially like around fuel efficiency or safety, is like invented in Formula One as like just state
Mhm,
of the art technology, and then it trickles down. Eventually, it gets cheaper. But when you look at, the concert technology, sound and visual technology, and also filmmaking technology, so much of it follows video games, like, over
mhm,
history, that video games kinda pioneer a thing, and that, what you're talking about, which is like a soundstage where you're not just recording a track and adjusting levels, you're saying, "Here are spatial objects of
mhm.
sound that you're gonna move around," or, "Here are spatial objects of a visual effect," that, if it's the Jedi Knight walks over here, then the camera knows to move the background, on the video wall behind them. Or if Taylor Swift moves over here, it knows that it's going to magnify this to create, enhance this depth of
Right.
field or something. But those are the same technology, and those essentially came from video game engines. Like
Mhm.
the Dolby Atmos, and there's I don't know what the other competing technology is, but these spatial things, like instead of just having a sound, the thing that the high end audiophiles are putting in their home theater systems right now, it's not just like it's a really good recording of a thing. It knows where your speakers are in the room. It knows where you are in the room, and it's moving the object around as you watch the Blu-ray to say a bird flies overhead, but it's
Right.
happening dynamically. And that's all video game stuff that you have sound points and keys and target objects and all that stuff.
Yeah, the Dolby Audio is a great example because that's a fairly new thing that's been rolled out. I think a lot of most theaters that you go into now will have it if they have revamped their stuff in the last 5 years or so. But yeah, they literally have a drawing of the array of speakers
Mhm.
in the in the theater itself, and then there's someone that does a track that
Mhm.
moves the audio around uh, that essentially that grid, and then whatever speakers are closest to it are the ones that are going to have it loudest, and then it falls off. And I know very little about the underpinning technology of that other than to say that it's like incredible, and
Well,
the
it's the
fact that
same it's the sound version of
yeah,
what you're doing, though, where you're having it kind of think of things as a dynamic field and then track them around reference points of what the audience sees and where the characters are going or
right.
where the action is happening. Um, but it is wild, because when you think of, I guess, culture, throughout time, like it's like people used to go and they would take like a trip to a giant cathedral. They would take a trip to like go see like the best oil paintings in the world that were on display because that was like the height of human experience of like.
Hmm.
And now you think about that, and it's kind of, I guess, movies and concerts. You've
Right.
heard the Taylor Swift song 100 times, but it's the goal of the engineer to give you this and the crew to give you this, and the designers to give you this experience that is more than the track. It's not just that you're
Yeah.
getting to see Taylor as a tiny dot at the end of the football stadium. You're communing with her through this audio visual ritual that people like you create.
But and it comes down to kind of one sort of like driving term for all of this stuff, right? It's the buzzword that everyone wants to use for whatever experience they're creating, which is immersion, right?
Hmm.
Is it immersive? Do
Mm.
you feel immersed in it, surrounded by it? Do you feel like you're inhabiting this experience that all of these people are working to create? Um, and everything is like in service of that primary, that prime mover is like, are we immersed in what we're doing? And
Mhm.
what sensory perception uh, helps that immersion, right? So that's the decisions that we're trying to make and use our intuition on as designers is like, will this serve the immersive experience that we're trying to create? Or
Mhm.
in some cases, break people's immersion, right? Like you have people throughout history that have sought to like flip that paradigm. Like I think about Brecht as someone who wants to like always remind people that you're watching a play rather than
Mhm.
immerse you in it. He wants to like do these big gestures that break you out of it. But very much the mode right now is like we want people as in the experience as possible, whether it's a concert, a TV show, a
Mhm.
movie, or walking through a theme park, right? Like we don't want to just go walk through the world and ride the ride and see the familiar like characters. We want to feel like we're a part of
Mhm.
the contiguous universe. And so even in like how like I think Galaxy's Edge is a great example of that, where it's like it wants to put people in the story of
Mhm.
of the theme park and like have you be a part of the narrative for while you're there.
Well, I think, too, like, the I've been to concerts before where there was some technical feat that was incredibly impressive and probably expensive, but it didn't do anything to connect me to the art. It didn't do anything. It almost, like, was a distraction from what was the point. Whereas I've been to other
Right.
places where I felt like I experienced the music in this way, that I could again and never could have any other way because of the experience that was designed and, the
Hmm.
immersion, for lack of a better word. Um, and now that, artists don't make any money because of Spotify and these things, there's been this push to make concerts. Artists have to do these huge tours. And so you see this huge concert industry that is different than it was 20 years ago. It's not going to the Dave Matthews concert and, twirling your tweed skirt on the grass and then, going like
Right.
there's this, it's almost like everything has to be a Flaming Lips concert now, a
Hmm.
lot of that experiential stuff from like the EDM world is now like in tiny singer-songwriter concerts, as soon as they're big enough to have a tour. Can you say
Totally.
something about like when the technology is working, how does the designer like work with the artist to plan a experience, and then when that fails, when that works, what makes that a system?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of times, especially in the world that I'm in right now, right? Like we have uh, there will be like a creative director that's working very closely with the artist, or sometimes that's us, but sometimes there's an outside party who's part of the team, part of the mission of like making the experience. But it always kind of wants to start with what the artist wants, like what they're dreaming of for their tour, what
So they
they
tell you this is the point of the album, or this is what I'm saying, in a way that maybe they don't say explicitly on the album?
yeah, or they'll give us whatever kind of like inspiration, resources, assets that they've already been like percolating on, because oftentimes there is an album that's like the reason for the tour, or there is
Mm,
a driving force behind. Sometimes it's like, oh, this band has been around for 30 years, we're going to do a 30th like anniversary tour. So then it's like, well, we want
mm,
this to be a retrospective, or conversely, we want to be looking forward, instead of looking back. And so there's a lot of times like that's where it all starts, is with what the what is the experience that the artist is trying to create, and then we're looking at, okay, how do we execute that, what can we add to uh, that vision, and then on the backside of it is like, what are the practical components that you need to achieve that. and it can be wildly different for depending on the show and the day. Uh, but it's a lot of times like this iterative process where it's like we get the initial brief, right, and then we go into the minds and we extract some ideas from the like raw materials that we have available to us, and then we come back and we say, okay, this is our approach to the vision. Do you feel
Mm.
like this is working? Do you feel like this serves um, the uh, the overall idea that you're trying to like connect to your audience through? And that process can take several passes. You know, we get feedback, we go back, we come back, and throughout that
What do
whole
you do when
thing,
you have somebody that's just impossible? Like they're not they want you to do they think they can do your job better than you, or they don't understand the
um, as a so as an individual, I feel like individual designer, just me personally, I feel like it's my goal not to let anything that I've done get precious,
Mhm.
right? If there's my goal is to serve the show and the artist that's trying to put the show on. So if something I'm doing is like not resonating with them, it's not in service of their vision, then like I'm okay letting a lot of things go. And you know,
Mm.
if I'm really like excited about the idea, maybe I'll put it in my back pocket for later. But I think that it's more important to do the show that they want to do and let them drive it. And the only time I think that we try to like push back is if there's a true like practical like we cannot get the truss, we cannot get the like lights, we cannot get the physical product that we need to make this happen
Mm.
for reason of availability or budget or whatever. Those are the moments where it's like, you know, we might have to have a dialogue about it.
Mm.
But broadly speaking, I think, you know, I would rather champion my ideas but not defend them to the death.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it does seem like, the designer or something used to just kind of be, more independent artists, but the kind of work that you're doing almost seems like it's more kind of religious or shamanic, and that you're trying to connect people to this greater experience. It isn't
and
just the nuts and bolts of how you get the sound to 80 people or whatever.
I mean, it's definitely the nuts and bolts too, but I think it's important to sort of hold both of those things in concert with each other, right? Like to be the conduit through which the nuts and bolts become the the broader experience. And the great thing about it being this hugely massively collaborative effort between a lot of creative people and a lot of like technical you know, engineering
Mhm.
types, and being a collaborative art form as live entertainment and film and theater
Mhm.
all are, is that there's space for everyone to like inhabit both of those roles. You know,
Mhm.
like I always like to think that like a good creative idea can come from anywhere in the production team. It doesn't have to come from, you know, me, the designer. It can come from the audio engineer or the screens programmer or anybody in that process. And I think that the more that we kind of all work together toward that vision, the like better product you're going to end up having because everyone believes in it.
Mhm.
And you have to believe in the world that you're creating for the audience because otherwise they're never going to believe it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that was the complaint about from the filmmakers and actors, and also the audiences, of that kind of low point in technology being misapplied, as people said that they didn't believe it.
Right.
There's that. I was kind of surprised that they even put it on there, but there was like that clip on the behind the scenes of The Hobbit, Blu-ray or something, where
Hmm.
um, there he, Ian McKellen's saying that he just broke down crying and was like, "This is not why I
Oh
became a
yeah.
filmmaker," because he was trying to talk to 18 dwarfs on sticks, and he just couldn't get into
Yeah,
the
you see the
flow.
pictures and it's like him and a bunch of green boxes on a green like set, but he's in like full like
Yeah.
Gandalf you know, makeup, and it's such a jarring juxtaposition. And it's like if your job as an actor is to believe in the world and inhabit it fully, and you're just
Mhm.
surrounded by nothing that even resembles what it is you're trying to portray, then like how could you get into character? Like how could you know?
Well, and it's not like the process of filmmaking, or the process of like doing a concert, the nuts and bolts of that haven't ever been at odds with the art. I mean, just you go to basic cinematography, like if you shoot a conversation wide, the actors can just talk and it's natural. If you're trying to shot reverse shot in a very tight way, you're having to make them say every single line at the camera and then stop and then set up for 15 minutes or an
Right.
hour and then come back and say the next line of a conversation, and then their ability to keep that in flow of conversation, and that's old school, filmmaking. So it's not, these aren't terribly new problems, but I think, just like anything, technology is kind of a non-specific amplifier. It makes,
Yeah,
it can make things
that's a
way
super
better or
good
way
point.
worse.
That like the nature of the actor's work is definitely to be able to like embody those states in any circumstance. But I think that yeah, the technology in the same way that it's like a force amplifier for creative work, right? A productivity amplifier. It can also amplify all of those like jarring things
Hmm.
um, for the actor. And I think too that it comes down to like experience. Like Ian
Hmm.
McKellen in particular, I think about like his long and storied history of being a conventional theatrical actor. So that experience of just living on the
In a
green
play
screen,
where you're doing the
right?
dialogue for 2 hours sometimes without
Yeah,
stop.
and yeah, in real time in that wide shot scenario, right? So there is no stop down, there is
Hmm.
no resetting the shot. It's like you get one run at it, and that's what the audience is going to remember. I could see, especially for someone like that, being in that circumstance with the green screen would just be extremely jarring because of his own experiences. Whereas someone that's like newer to the game, just coming up in it, it's like, oh yeah, this is just part of the gig.
Somebody who's an ADD TikTok streamer that was, like, they're going to be able to adapt to that world better. I
Right.
wonder
Well,
if it
yeah.
is like the jump from, famously, like a lot of actors could not jump into talkies when sound was added to movies. They couldn't make the cut because they couldn't project, or their voice didn't fit the character type that they could play in silent film or something like that. Maybe not as dramatic, but I wonder if there's not something here that you have the way that film is made and presented changing so quickly that
Mhm.
certain legacy types of acting style can't keep up, or maybe this changes acting style that people who came up and all they know is the LED wall are going to have, be a noticeably different movement of acting, when you look back on it 50 years from now.
Right. Yeah. I think, yeah, it's, I think that's one thing that like a lot of times I'll say like the future of what we do is impossible to predict, but I think that the cycles are predictable. And I
Hmm.
think we did see the move from silent film to talkies created a like a struggle of evolution. And
Hmm.
then from uh but also from like uh, theatrical actors to film actors, but then also the other direction. Like whenever there's like a resurgence in Broadway interest, and
Hmm.
someone from movies tries to go be a Broadway performer, and if they don't have the right like sound amplification, like those people have a lot of like difficulty projecting
Hmm.
for a crowd in a space because they're used to projecting for a boom mic directly over their head. And
I
it could
wonder,
just
like, how bad it would be to put Eddie Redmayne in a play. Because even with the wonders of, THX advanced audio, every movie that I've ever seen Eddie Redmayne in is him going.
right, yeah, it's someone who's very quiet, like, they're gonna have trouble in a theatrical space, even with, the mics and the amplification that we have because it's a different paradigm, um, and it all comes back to, like, what people are used to.
I'm curious too, because like a lot of this stuff is cheaper to make than it's ever been because of technology, like you're describing at Disney, or just
Mhm,
some of these concerts would not have been possible. I mean, you just could not have concerts on that scale, you know, even 10 years ago. Some of them, what they're able to do now. But I wonder if that changes the way that content is kind of produced and who has access to it and who you distribute versus who you don't. Like, it
uh,
seems like things like electronic music tend to stay in the festival circuit. Like, you have to go
mhm,
camp out and, maybe, take mushrooms or something if you're gonna go listen to a certain kind of band, whereas, the Live Nations are not doing those as much. As it's a different investor pool, it's a different business model than the Taylor Swift concert, or the Drake tour.
yeah, I think excuse me. I think that there has definitely been a democratization of the tools for creativity. The fact that you can, there are free and open source alternatives for just about any like creative platform that's out there. So if you're willing to like take the time to learn those and become dexterous in them in the same way that the like mainstream tools are. Um, you can create like there's very little barrier between what someone can create working in their house on a gaming laptop and what someone can create in a multi-million-dollar studio, other than time and like number of people that are like
Mm-hmm.
all throwing their work at it at once. And I think that's a very exciting thing because it allows for so many more people to do interesting things and take bigger risks than like the large budgeted studios are willing to make.
Mm.
Uh, you can, if you have an idea for something and access to YouTube, like you can teach yourself how to do it with more ease than I think there ever has been. And increasingly, some of those open source tools are like working their way into the mainstream anyway, because as more people like put their efforts behind developing those programs, their viability kind of comes on the same level as the professional tool sets.
Mm-hmm.
So then it comes back to like, what are you used to using, or what can you teach yourself how to adapt to? Um, so I think it's a super exciting time in that way for those more like indie projects. And I guess I'm thinking more in like animation and like
Mm-hmm.
short form like video. That's where you see a lot of those like indie ideas like take shape. But the production value on some of the stuff that's like out there is astounding for it being like
Mm-hmm.
one or two guys. Just
Yeah,
like
was it that Godzilla minus one or Godzilla that recent? I remember
mhm.
looking at the effects of that versus the giant U.S. big budget, 480 million plus marketing deal, and it
Oh
was
yeah,
just like this one looks better, and they spent
right.
$1 million. How did they do that? You know?
Yeah, and I love that one because of the stylistic like sort of throwbacks to the early Godzilla movies too. Just like it
Hmm.
seems like filmically, it feels, and it's one of the things that like I can't articulate it even
Hmm.
though I'm watching it, but like it feels like a old school Godzilla movie, um, but done in like a very sort of modern quality production value kind of way. Uh,
Hmm.
and I think that's I'm excited for more things like that to happen as this technology continues to, I hope, spread and become more available to more people that are interested in like getting into this world.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And do you have any idea where it goes from here? Do you see, the next version of this being that you could, unroll the dot light tarp in your apartment and have, somehow the ability to do what we're now doing in studios, for a couple $100 on the gaming laptop, or where does this go?
Uh, I'm going to go back to my it's impossible to predict answer first, and then I'll qualify that. Because I do think that as the technology continues to advance and expand, uh, I think all it will take is for one person to like find the right combination of pieces and parts and do that, and then show
Mm,
everyone how it was done. And then I think you'll see an explosion, right, of
mhm,
everybody trying to do it, because kind of that's what happened with in-camera VFX, is that like that became virtual production became a buzzword as soon as one show did really well using that production paradigm.
mm,
Um, and then all of a sudden everyone's trying to do it, right? And there's this huge like glut of shows that are all using LED volumes as their backdrop, um, and some do it really well, and some don't do it as well, and that's kind of the nature of like seeing what works and what doesn't. But uh, I would hope to see more of the like indie projects using that kind of tech in the future because of the wide availability. And it may not be like roll out the dot matrix in your apartment, but it may be you can rent this super high resolution LED tile from the like local
mm,
rental house, and book a studio space for a week and
mhm.
go in and shoot your whole thing in that like 1 week of filming, and then that becomes like the breakout way of doing the next cool thing.
Hmm. Do any of this go into like live action plays, like Broadway type stuff? It seems like sometimes they resist technology in plays more than even in like music?
I've seen a couple of, and I can't think of specifics right now, but I have seen a couple shows that use LED backdrop as opposed to um, like a painted or practical set. I've seen more projection
Mm-hmm.
use in theatrical production, but again, that technology has been around longer, and you can kind of get away with some like stylistic choices in projection that you can't necessarily with like the LED.
Mm-hmm.
Um, something about the way that LED contributes to the light of a given environment makes it so that if it's not almost a character in the show itself, it I think can make it kind of hard to juxtapose with the action in a theatrical environment, and the projection being just a little bit softer.
Mm-hmm.
But with LED, you don't have to fight. Your lighting doesn't have to fight your back wall, whereas with projection, you always have to be super careful about whether or not you're accidentally washing
Yeah.
that content. So there's
Hmm.
pros and cons to either one. I think we will. I think we'll probably see more LED. I think something that it could be very useful for is like what we call like set extension,
Mm-hmm.
uh, where it's like
You
you've built.
project the set around the audience or something.
Well, and more so like you've built your practical set on stage, right? In your
Mm-hmm.
traditional proscenium set. But then behind that, your like last piece is an LED wall that's able to change, if it's like you've got the buildings of a fishing village or something, right? And that's where your play takes place. And then it's like you draw the rest of the fishing village and the like ocean and the sunset in the backdrop. And then because it's a real-time video piece, it's like now you've got the whole village kind of realized, and you can do progression through time of day or change the lighting or bring in a thunderstorm or like all of these things that you can do as long as you've got like a content guy that's able to like create those effects. And then you get the real lighting of that on your practical physical village. I'm drawing from a couple of things that I have seen recently. So the artist The Weeknd, one of his more recent stadium set designs was this big like cityscape, practical set, illuminated like windows on these buildings that were like platforms and things. And then behind that was like the rest of the city. And, that they would just transform that cityscape using, CG effects and things on the LED wall, and then change the lighting and sort of like that would evoke the same stylistic choices on the practical elements. So it felt like this like city was moving through these fast changes with every
Oh, wow.
song.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm thinking of The Witcher 1 had this dynamic weather that it wasn't really cued to anything in a script. It would just naturally blow across the world as you were exploring, and this was this like
Right.
amazing thing that you would never experience the same combination of like light direction, weather, wind, humidity. All of it was controlled separately and sort of mixed together. And now that stuff is trickling into film.
Yeah, totally. And it's like you got to find the right application for it. Certainly, because it could become so distracting to the action
Hmm.
of the story that it's like now it's not
Hmm.
serving the creative anymore. But as like a subtle sort of inclusion, I think it has a lot of potential. Uh,
Hmm. Yeah, then when the smart home thing was going on, I remember like they were like, "Well, if you spend $200 more on light bulbs, you can have like a lightning storm embrace your kitchen." And I was like, "Well, okay, that's kind of neat, but I don't really, I,
I don't think I
I
want that in
I'm
my
very
kitchen.
broke and a social worker in Alabama." But you could see, if you were doing like a role playing, D&D or something, that there a lot of that stuff being cheaper and easier for the individual to program from their phone makes
Oh, absolutely.
exciting opportunities.
And they've actually I just saw this is not related at all to what I do or anything, but
Hmm.
there's a product that's a set of like polyhedral dice
Hmm.
that are connected to an app that has hooks into one of the like common home automation platforms. The
Hmm.
if this then that.
Hmm.
And so it's like you can set conditions where it's like, oh, if I roll a natural 20, if
Yeah.
this, then that is going to go hit all of the lights in my
Oh, wow.
Dungeons and Dragons room and like change the color, like do a strobe or whatever you program. And so it's like there is kind of like and in that way, right, it serves that immersion, because now it's like this thing has happened for this character, and now the world changes as a result of it, and it's like you feel that because the world around you is changing, your perception has changed because you've got this tie into this technology that can, you know, change the environment of the lighting or make a sound effect in the room from the like speakers or something, like triggered on an action in real time, as opposed to being a pre-programmed sort of like a cued element.
Yeah, and you as you make the environment more automated or more able to just react to things organically, and you're thinking about it less as part of your process, it just becomes something that enhances that, you know. I think
Exactly.
James Cameron was kind of ahead of the curve when he was talking about Avatar, because he basically was doing this, but with technology that wasn't here yet. I mean,
Right.
you granted you needed $200 million to do that back then, but that was sort of why Avatar worked in a way that a lot of those things did not work um,
Oh,
that
absolutely.
well. Well, that's interesting stuff. What do you think about like you know, because the world that you're building for the artist already is sort of, you know, a digital space, you know, to you take to the concert. Do you see things like AR VR concerts where you buy a ticket and put on a HoloLens and, you know, walk around and see the live concert, you know, becoming something that are the direction things go in, or is that
It's so there have been some like executions of that that I've seen that are like fun.
mhm
It's something that I kind of daydream about
mhm
a lot of the time. Is like, you know, the glasses are like almost there. They're so
mhm
close. They're not there yet.
mhm
But it is a very it's like you can look at it through your phone, and so often people have their phones out anyway
mhm
at a concert, so there's definitely potential there that like you scan a QR code and you get an app, and that app is basically running a separate, you know, composite plate across
mhm
your phone that's like tracking spatially and can show you like this added layer
mhm
of performance. um and I think that like that has a ton of interesting potential in maybe the next 10
mhm
years, 10 to 15. Um, but I'm always like open to being surprised and be like, oh, someone already did it and I just didn't
mhm
know about it. Like that happens to me all the time. Um, I think that creating that sort of um, I don't, it's like they talk of, you know, for a while there was like the third screen was kind of the
mhm
a conceptual thing in video games and some TV as well, right? But you'd have like an app that would like follow along with the show, and
yeah.
that's what you'd look at on your phone while you're watching it on your
Quibi sort of killed that
right.
pretty
Yeah,
quickly. Yeah,
died a very
yeah,
sudden death,
and
and
completely
then
predictable one. I don't know.
yeah,
Oh.
and then everyone kind of backed away from it. But I think there is going to be at least continued like experimentation in like how do we bring that, because that is another component of the like in camera VFX paradigm, is like you'll have the LED wall set extension, but then
Mhm,
you may also have like a foreground that is the AR component, where it's like you're generating things not only behind the performance but also in front of it or interacting through it.
mhm,
Um, those tend to be really involved, right? Because now you've got to track where the virtual object is in space relative to your performers who are real,
mhm.
relative to the background, and so that can get very like complicated very fast and requires a lot
Well,
of
they're
very
tracking a lot of them with digital, kind of chips and body tags anyway, to know where the light to hit and the laser effect to come on, and,
right.
I mean, they're already doing it, or where the, you know, the shotgun mic is gonna point for some things.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely have like, you know, performer trackers for spotlights and things like that, and it's like if you can feed all of that data into one homogenized system, which those platforms do exist. But it comes down to like you have to have very tight calibration, and
Mhm.
you have to have like very strong
Shake
processing.
your Taylor Swift in a figure eight until the compass points north again. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, you know, there's a little bit of that, right? It's
Yeah.
like you gotta like grab the tracker and you gotta like walk it around the stage and be sure. And it's like if that data drops for any reason, then suddenly things will go haywire because you're getting position values that are like nulls. So it's like you can do those things. They're not totally, or at least in my experience, you have to have a more controlled environment.
Mm,
They're not so like shoot from the hip yet that you
mhm,
can just like deploy it and it'll just work. It's like there's a lot of fine tuning, but it is one of those things that's like constantly improving and
mhm.
developing. Um, Again, I think we'll see more of the easier it gets to like deploy those things.
Hmm. Well, which maybe, synthesizes things like movies and concerts and plays as they're using the same technology, you know?
Mhm.
I mean, I think that the 360 camera thing came and went too early. Like it kind of they shot their shot. Everyone wanted to, and Silicon Valley has to pretend like one thing's going to catch on, in the next year in order to keep their stock up, and then maybe
Right.
one of 10 of those things lasts. But that was kind of the promise of those 360 cameras, that as long as you had the ball with the 360 camera, anywhere you went, somebody could interact with like it was a completely virtual space as long as they had VR.
Mhm.
And none of it was quite there, but we maybe go back to that place in a professional situation. I don't know that it ever catches on for. I don't really ever want to know what's happening behind the podcaster that I'm watching. Like
Right.
sometimes the 19:10 aspect ratio is just all you need for things like a movie. um,
Totally. I think that's a very salient point, right? Is again, sometimes the technology becomes the tail wagging the dog when it's like, this does not serve the experience.
Especially
They,
when the technology is propping up the shareholder value of some giant
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you see any like red herrings, false paths, places where people are pretending are kind of gonna to pan out that are not really real, or you don't feel like or there's anything to them?
Um, I I never really think about like betting on something to fail because usually that's a recipe for disaster in an environment where like people are constantly investing more and more into everything and pushing things like further and further. Um, because like for instance, the AR like things like would be something that some people might say like is a gimmick and is like doomed to fail. But I think a better way to look at it is like it's not ready yet for prime time, right? But I don't think there's anything that without enough like time and attention to it that's like not gonna find a niche somewhere in the market. Um, that someone's not going to be able to do something cool and amazing with it. Like I think that just everything is sort of brimming with potential in this moment. And maybe that's kind of a rose-colored view of it. I'm sure there's people out there that would turn up their nose at that idea and say like, no, there's lots of things that are gimmicks um, and they're probably not going to pan out. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that I've reacted to lately that I wasn't like, oh, this is really cool um, and has potential.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like visual effects and polish, I mean, I think all of that stuff it's inevitable. It's how do you do it in a way that works well. I mean, the stuff that scares me, not just now, but in any era, is when you're getting rid of the writer. Like so many of the problems that Hollywood has had, it just comes back to like write a script that's good
Oh
before
yeah.
you do the movie. And when there's just 8 hours of whirlwind and hurricane and Optimus, and then nothing happens, and like
Mhm.
that's the kind of filmmaking that I don't like, that I feel like is bad for culture. It's
Yeah.
like Marvel movies and a lot of stuff, they get flack, but I was just kind of like, yeah, but somebody made a plan, like not just for the movie that they were making and spending $200 million on, but for 5 movies in a row. Like, like, yeah, maybe this is not, Leonardo da Vinci or something, but I've just been begging the industry to just write a script before they hit
Right.
record, like, and for some reason we couldn't do that for 15 years. Like, um,
Yeah, I think that the taking the long view on any of these like concepts is definitely the way to identify what probably has some staying power versus what's going to need to go through a lot of evolution before it gets that staying power.
mhm,
And the thing that's always going to bring people back more than anything else is not the production, quality or the cool tech or the VFX. Like that'll attract some people, right, that are like
mhm.
in it for that. But that at the end of the day, it's that good story, that immersive like experience that you can connect to and resonate with. That is what people want to spend their money to go be a part of.
Mhm.
Uh,
Well, and I think that's why the script is not the story in the way that a lot of people make it. I mean, I like writing and I talk more about kind of like plot structure and things, but I mean, something like Blade Runner, the first one, the set is telling you the story. I mean, you're walking through
Mhm.
it and you're seeing there's 3 layers of set built on top of each other, and the world was this, and they had this idealistic future, and then it didn't work out, and now it's being retrofitted because the dream fell apart. And Harrison Ford's not walking around telling you, like, well, in the 50s of the future, we thought big fins on cars and we were optimistic, but then the 70s happened and the space 70s, and like no one's
Right.
doing any of that. It's that you're being told that by a set, which is why
Mhm.
design is important and part of storytelling in a way that I think we forget.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and environmental storytelling, as it were.
Mhm.
Um,
Maybe escape rooms too. Maybe that's the next frontier. So
oh, hmm.
you got some ideas there?
Well, uh, so escape rooms, I think. So for a while, of course, I lived in Orlando, which maybe had like a glut of escape rooms in the like pre-pandemic
Mhm.
moment, like 2020, like 16 to 2019. I feel like there was a new escape
Social
room.
distance by locking yourself in a room with 12 people.
Yeah, so that maybe hampered the growth of the escape room industry a little bit, but it didn't slow it down much, to be completely honest. Because I went back recently, and it still felt like there's an escape room on every corner.
Mhm.
Um, but they are,
Now they're gutting them and turning them into axe throwing. I
yes,
just
actually,
it really
yeah,
does feel like the local business, like, boom bust cycle is just like somebody spinning a dial where they're like,
yeah,
"Now it's frozen
drying
yogurt.
goods, yeah,
Now it's cupcakes that are weird flavors. Now
the
it's axes." Like,
yeah,
this would
pulling
be
words out
perfect.
of a hat and being like, okay, this is the new experiential uh, installation that we're going to do. Van Gogh projection experiences.
Oh, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
little bit bigger than the small business, but, the like,
right.
I don't know. Is yogurt by the pound still a thing? I think all of ours closed. Like,
Oh yeah, we got one here near my house now. It does decent um, on like high foot traffic days. Tastes good. But escape rooms, I think, actually have the opportunity to implement a lot of like very cool technologies that don't scale well,
mhm,
but create a very like interesting immersive experience on like a on that micro level on which they operate, where it's like you can have Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, like these small microcontroller elements that are like smart like devices that suddenly become keys or clues or
mm,
like things that you can like interact with and touch and hold, and that's a completely different kind of like experiential art that uses technology in a completely different way than like the macro scale of a 10,000 person concert. Now it's like you're making an experience for 12 people and it's much more
mhm.
intimate. And like the things that you can do there are so cool, um, and fun to like execute. And I get really into the tech of it, even though I think that there's been like maybe too many people trying to do it all at
Yeah,
once. Um, but the fast like the things you can do with like a maglock and an infrared chip uh,
mhm.
are pretty spectacular on that like 12 person in a room kind of scale.
Well, I think that is, kind of why the failure of Disney's, like, Star Cruiser, Galactic Star Cruiser hotel thing. I mean, the people made a lot of noise about the price, but what I kept seeing, I mean, I didn't go to anything like that, but what I kept seeing was that it was like that you could see sort of like Cyberpunk, all of these things that had been started in development as really cool concepts that could immerse you and then sort of not executed and abandoned. So you saw half of, 100 good ideas and none of it really was telling you the story that they were trying to tell you.
Yeah, by the time Star Cruiser was open, I think I had already moved on.
Mhm.
um and of course never got a chance to go because so much of when it was open was like through the pandemic era, and then we were like
Yeah.
busy, and that wasn't something that I was like uh, I couldn't get away from or find like a block of time when I was like, this is the chance to go do this. And then all of a sudden it was
Mhm.
closing, and I was like, well, I guess I missed my shot. But conceptually, right? Like they were totally keyed into the idea of immersion. They were really gonna like put you in it
Mhm.
for maybe to a fault. Like I don't know. It's hard to say um, that like maybe the ambition was like more than technically possible to execute. But I think there were a lot of really good ideas that went into it that we'll probably see again.
That's
Um,
why I mention escape rooms with movies and concerts, is I kind of wonder if eventually you don't see these experience technologies cohere into something like that. I mean, is that's not really a hotel, it's not really a theme park, it's not really a movie, you know,
mhm.
it's not really a concert, but it is kind of
But it is a
you being
story.
dropped into
Yeah.
a completely virtual space that is also somewhat analog, you know.
Right.
Uh,
It's absolutely telling you a story, and you are the driver of the
mhm.
narrative in that case, because like you are the character and your goal is to escape. And it's a straightforward motivation, but like there are so many cool twists and turns that it can take as you like go on that process.
Yeah, so let's
Um,
do it. Let's make Westworld. That ended well, right?
oh yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. There's nothing that could possibly go wrong because and we've got all the pieces now because we've got AI, we've got humanoid robots, we've got cool interactive tech that we can give to people and ways to record their every like thought and motion as they make their way through the story. So like let's just put them all together and watch the
you get iconic
yeah.
scenes where Yul Brynner says, "Unfortunately, I'm a large language model, and my database only goes back to 2023." Like,
Right. It's yeah. The my safety programming doesn't allow me to engage with this conversation any further. Please try, you know, reframing
I'm
your
sorry, Hal. You need to subscribe to ChatGPT 4 for
right.
$29 a month.
You have run out of interactions with this robot for today. Please upgrade your subscription.
Well, I appreciate you getting together. Do you want to tell us about any? You want to pitch anything, or tell us about the company that you work with, or the opportunities that they offer? Anything we don't get to, you feel like is important thing to hit on?
Oh no, I was mostly just here to chat today, right? Like it's um it's just great to be on and great to like talk about some of this stuff. And I'm always super interested in kind of the psychology underpinning um, how we make these decisions and how we create experiences for each other. So it's like it's cool to come on and sort of do the reverse, right? Where we talk about the technology of how we
Mhm.
do it. And I hope that this can kind of like inform, as you're going forward in the series, like, how you think about the other aspects of this that aren't the tech, that are the creative and that are the like writing
Mhm.
and thoughts that go into um, how
Yeah,
we experiences.
and it's hard to get like the technology, the psychology, and the technology of filmmaking is interesting. It's easy to talk about the kind of like psychology of like the artist, the process of like writing or something, but some parts of filmmaking are so hard to get into. Like, always like Roger Deakins has a podcast, The Cinematographer, and he like talks a lot with his wife on there, but there's like not anything that would ever let you learn his process because it's so intuitive that he's just like, yeah, sometimes you want to use a really wide lens, but other times you do this. But, like when I see a color, I can tell you, within like a teeny tiny fraction of a possibility exactly the chemical composition that Kodak used to pull that color out, how many stops it is of whatever. But it's just like he's so incredibly technical,
Right.
very naturalistically that there's not really he's just not the cinematographer that is gonna be like, oh, when you use the 16 millimeter and you push it forward slowly, you feel like you're flying, and that creates a dreamlike. He just doesn't think that way,
Right. It's very much something that's like baked into
how he
something.
sees the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
reactions to the world around you and the stimulus, and it's like that's what it's your own intuition that you use to drive your own creative, and you just hope that it resonates with other
He
people.
never mentions it. Like he doesn't bring it up, but the guests that he's had on have said things like that. Like when they redid Fargo, he told them that their film stock had degraded because the color of the sweatshirt was like the wrong kind of brown. And they were like, "No, we've double checked it." And he was like, "No, it's wrong." And they're like, "You haven't seen this for 25 years." And he was like, "It's just not right." And then they saw that like one chemical had been messed up, or
It's
that he
amazing.
can see the difference in like 1/16th of a stop of light. You can tell if there's a shutter leak, because one of the blades of your, ultra primes is not right.
Yeah, I always wonder if people that have that sort of like almost extrasensory ability, I wonder if they have like some mild form of like synesthesia where they're like not just seeing it, but like having
Something
some
is
other
being
sense
filtered
that's
out.
tripping.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it has to bother them. We don't
Mhm.
dedicate resources to things that don't cause us anxiety. And
Right.
so, that's I think that's so much of under the creative process is you've seen the same thing so many times, you don't like it, you feel anxious about it, and then you innovate. And in the
Yeah,
same
it's
way,
like,
he's being bothered by that, the film grain is not perfect, in a
yeah,
way that
you
no.
see, you just see it, but then it's like you're not seeing that it's wrong. It's like you're feeling that it's wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
in this very interesting way.
well, I really appreciate you coming on today. It's great to talk to you. We have to,
Yeah.
like a lot of people that have a topic that's so broad, maybe we can do it again with something else. And technology will probably be totally different in a couple years. But anywhere people can go if they want to check out anything that even if it's just something you recommend that resources for people interested in jumping off points from anything we talked about today.
Oh, yeah, I would totally, if you're interested in this kind of like world and the kinds of things that are possible, like as a creator, you probably already know about it, but I would highly recommend downloading like Blender as a 3D like creative tool. I would check out something like Unreal Engine, which is free for small creators, people with revenue under like $1 million can just download the engine and tool around with it. And they have a lot of like cool templates and stuff. And it's like there's and Unreal Engine is a video game engine, but it's also they have this entire workflow for creatives for doing like film and live production and things like that. And you can see it. I think they have like case studies and things on their website, Epic Games of like different cool things that they've been a part of. So that's where I would start if you're interested in like the future of where live real-time environment design is going in concert to film for sure.
Well, cool. Yeah. Thank you so much. And if there's, I can look and put a link to some of that stuff in the show notes.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I appreciate you coming on. And Andy Philpo, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Joel.
There's no business like show business, like no business I know. Everything about it is appealing.